So hold on one second. All right, let's get started. Mesechta Eruvin, as the name suggests, is about setting up Eruvin. By the way, an Eruv, like we refer to an Eruvin, in our city, where we have these strings and wires and different things going around the city, connecting us. We'll describe exactly how that works, but as that calling that an Eruv is really a colloquialism. What those are walls that we set up, Halachic walls, in order to turn the city into one giant Rishus HaYachid, one giant private domain. We'll get to the different domains in a moment. But in reality, what an Eruv is really the meal that connects the different properties contained within one large Rishus HaYachid. Meaning, even if there was no Eruv, like the mechitzos, the walls that we create. So let's say an apartment building. So you want to go from one apartment to another apartment. So the Gemara tells us that Shlomo HaMelech created an institution called Eruvei Chatzeros, connecting of the different properties, where one cannot carry from one property to another property without setting up a communal meal. So that communal meal is something that so this Erev Pesach, I renewed the Erev Chatzeros for the city that connects all of the private homes within the large Rishus HaYachid. But that's, the term Eruv is really a colloquialism that we're going to discuss, how we set up an Eruv. We'll discuss very little of that, but I want to discuss a couple other sugyas that come up in the Mesechta. The Gemara tells us that there is a necessity to set up such an Eruv. The Gemara says the following. We'll return to this Gemara soon. But the Gemara says, Hahu Yenuka, the Ishbuch Hamime, that there was a baby that needed a bris milah, and for medicinal purposes, they needed to, before the baby had its bris and also after the baby had its bris, bathe the baby in warm water. That was what was needed to be done. The doctors assumed at the time that the baby could die from infection if it was not cleaned properly with warm water, with hot water. So there was a situation that came up that there was a baby that needed a bris milah, but the water that they prepared before Shabbos spilled out. It was the ishbuch hamime. It spilled. So Amar Lahu Rabba said, Natule hamime migu basi, that should just go get water from my house. I have hot water in the house. It's in another part of the city. So just go and receive it. So Amar le Abaye said to Rabba, who was the Rav, he said, V'holo arvinan. We didn't set up an Eruv. So Amar le, he says, Nisbo Hashito. So then rely on the Shituf Mavos, which is basically taking the back alleyways, which is another type of an Eruv that he assumed they set up. Amar le, Halo Shaftinan. We didn't set up a Shituf Mavos. So he says, so Nimrele Lenafri Leisile. So then go tell a non-Jew to go and receive the water for us. Basically, you could tell a non-Jew to go carry the water for the baby. So the Gemara has the whole discussion whether or not that was the right call to make. The Gemara ends off and says that it was the right call to make, but the Gemara then says the following. Take a look. The Gemara says, Amarle Rabba bar Chana la Abaye. Rabba bar Chana said to Abaye, Mevo de isbe tre gavre ravavi karabanan. That if you have a city, you have a town that has these two great rabbis. So how could it be lo lahavube lo eruv lo shito if they don't have an eruv in it? How could that be? So Amarle, so Abaye said to him, he said, my navad, what are we supposed to do? Mar lav orche. It's not in the proper honor for Rabbah to go set up an eruv. And Anna, turidna begirsi. And I'm too busy learning, which apparently for someone like Abaye is a legitimate excuse as to why there isn't an eruv set up. The Mordechai was one of the Rishonim who's a commentary on the Rif. points out on this Gemara, he says that under normal circumstances, based on the way that Rabba Bar Chana, Rabba was the son of Chana, phrased this rhetorical question, how could it be that there's no Eruv in the city, makes it seem that there is an obligation then for the Rav to set up an Eruv in the city. The Rosh likens this to the Gemara in Beitza, the Truvas Harash. In Klal Chaf Aleph, Siman Ches, the Rosh, in his responsa, he says that, the Gemara tells us with regards to setting up an Eruv Tafshilin, that the Rav has a responsibility to set up an Eruv Tafshilin for himself, and also that his Eruv Tafshilin is going to be for everyone in the community, that just in case someone forgot, they could rely on the Rav's Eruv. So the just like the Gemara in Beitza on Daf Tes Zayin, I believe, Tes Zayin, Yud Zayin, somewhere around there, requires the Rav to set up an Eruv Tafshilin. So too, there's a requirement for the Rav to make sure that there's an Eruv in the city that allows people to carry on Shabbos, lest someone come to violate Shabbos. So just from the outset, it's important for us to recognize that all of these laws of Eruvin that are contained within Mesechta Eruvin are all really important for us to know. The Avnei Nezer points out, the Aruch LaNer points out in his commentary to Mesechta Eruvin, he says that the three hardest Mesechtas in Shas, this is based on the Zohar, the three hardest Mesechtas in Shas are Eruvin, Niddah, and Yevamos. Eruvin, the halachos are very, very difficult, but nevertheless, of course, there's a responsibility for us to learn them because we have to know the entire Torah, but there's a unique responsibility for us to know these halachos because it's necessary for us to be able to set up an Eruv in the community so that way we don't, God forbid, come to make a mistake in carrying in the community. The Gemara that I want to start with,
Aruch LaNer.
Who
was the commentary in Sukkah? They have them everywhere.
That's right. The Aruch LaNer, he wrote another sefer also called the Bikurei Yaakov. Rav Yaakov Ettlinger was the Aruch LaNer. Rav Yaakov Ettlinger has a commentary. Basically, it's a commentary on Rashi on Shas. He expounds Rashi in all of the Mesechtas that the Pnei Yehoshua does not have a commentary for the most part. But that was really, he writes in the introduction to his work that his main focus was to fill in the blanks of the Pnei Yehoshua. The Aruch LaNer, though, probably gained his fame not from the Aruch LaNer, but rather from his book, the Bikurei Yaakov. The Bikurei Yaakov is a sefer, which is a commentary to the Shulchan Aruch on Hilchos Sukkah and Daled Minim. The Bikurei Yaakov has been accepted like the Bible with regard to Hilchos Sukkah and Daled Minim, and that's why you see whenever you learn either Mesechta Sukkah or Hilchos Sukkah, you're going to see the Bikurei Yaakov quoted on every single page in the Mishnah Berurah, probably 5 times on one page in the Mishnah Berurah, and quoted by all of the poskim with regard to Mesechta Sukkah and Hilchos Sukkah. Bikurei Yaakov was unbelievable. The Aruch LaNer was unbelievable. So the Gemara teaches us that there are really 4 types of reshuyos, 4 types of areas, domains, with regard to the laws of carrying on Shabbos. This is the Gemara in Mesechta Shabbos on Daf Vav. It also happens to be a Gemara in Eruvin on Daf Vav. But the Gemara tells us the following: Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught, Daled Reshuyos LeShabbos. There are 4 reshuyos, 4 domains regarding carrying on Shabbos. And what are they? Reshus HaYachid, the private domain; Reshus HaRabim, public domain; the Carmelis. Carmelis is a rabbinic Reshus HaRabim. So it is. It's not a Reshus HaYachid. It's not a Reshus HaRabim. It's an intermediate type of a Reshus, which is why it's called a Carmelis in the first place. The Aruch HaShulchan explains that the word Carmelis comes to the word Carmel, which is where the grain is not yet ripe yet. It's at the intermediary point. It's already grown, but it's not ripe yet. So that's why it's called a Carmelis. It's this intermediary type of a place. And then there's also a Makom Ptur, which is basically something that sticks out of the Rishus Harabim. Basically, it's in the public domain, but it sticks out enough that makes it into separate from the public domain. So I'll give you an example. First, let's just define what's a Rishus Harabim. That's a much bigger discussion. What defines a Rishus Harabim? We're going to focus more on what defines a Rishus Hayachid. What defines a Rishus Harabim, basically, al regel achas, on one foot, it is something that needs to be at least tes zayin amma. It needs to be at least 16 amos wide. It needs to be mafulosh. It needs to be straight from one end of the city to the other. Basically, there is one road that can take it from one end of the city to the other. It needs to have travelers that go through the city. According to Rashi and Tosos, at least 600,000 that travel on a daily basis through the city. There are a lot of definitions that create something as a Rishus Harabim. That, generally speaking, there really isn't a Rishus Harabim today. Yeah, Rabbeinu Tam, what's up?
What if there's like 600 inconsistently, but what days there's going to be 600?
Yeah, so something like that. The Aruch HaShulchan says that would be considered a Rishus Harabim. But generally speaking,
as close as we get, right?
What?
Probably the 5 is as close as we can get in San Diego.
Yeah, so the Ramban writes that highways, by definition, are Rishus Harabims, even if it doesn't fit into these other definitions. A highway, though, is a Rishus Harabim because it is, how the Rabbim, how the public commutes. But generally speaking, unless it's a highway or something like that, it's very hard to find a real deoraisa Rishus Harabim today. The Aruch HaShulchan has a really additional wacky explanation that has not been accepted by the poskim definition of what a Rishus Harabim is, where he says that the hay in Rishus Harabim is very important. It's a hey idea, basically saying that it needs to be the public thoroughfare. That a city has multiple. Most cities have a lot of main streets, right? So take Manhattan for example. There's Broadway, there's Madison, there's Lexington, there's Fifth Avenue, there's 7th Avenue, right? There's all these different very large avenues and streets that are all really considered main streets. But says the Aruch HaShulchan, therefore by definition, Manhattan can't be considered a Rishus Harabim, because a Rishus Harabim needs to be that you have a city with only one public thoroughfare, which is Main Street. But the Aruch HaShulchan has not been accepted. But regardless, it's very difficult to come up with a real Rishus Harabim Doraisa, which is really why we are even able to set up Eruvin in our cities today, because the Gemara tells us that one is only allowed to set up an Eruv on something that is a Rishus Harabim Derabanan, basically something that would be considered a Carmelis. One would be allowed to set up an Eruv, turn it into a Rishus Hayachid. But if it's a real Rishus Harabim, you can't, which is why when setting up communal Eruvin, you have to make sure you avoid the highways, as you brought up before, Gavin. You have to make sure, like, our Eruv avoids the 5. It does not cross over the 5. Otherwise, it would ruin the entire Eruv. A Makom Ptur is basically, like I said before, something like a fire hydrant where it sticks out of the Rishus Harabim above 3 tefachim from the ground. It's not a Rishus Hayachid because it doesn't fit the parameters of being a Rishus Hayachid. A Rishus Hayachid needs to be, the definition of it is that it needs to have walls that are at least 10 tefachim high, which is about 40 inches high. It needs to have, at a minimum, according to most Rishonim, three walls. The Rambam seems to say that it needs to have 4 walls, but that's a discussion in the Rambam. Seems to be a steer in the Rambam, what he assumes. But according to most Rishonim, it needs to have at least 3 walls. It needs to be at least 4 amos in width. in order for it to be considered a Rishus Hayachid. So a fire hydrant, what is it? It sticks out of the Rishus Harabim, but it's not a Rishus Hayachid either. And therefore, what we considered it to be is something called the Makom Ptur, which is basically if you were to transfer an item onto it, it would only be an Isser Dirabanan. What's interesting is that the Yerushalmi, when it goes through its list, it does not include Makom Ptur. All it has on the list is Rishus Hayachid, Rishus Harabim, and Carmelis. It does not include Makom Ptur. So the Totzos Chaim, Rabbi Menachem Zemba, tries to figure out why is it that the Yerushalmi did not include Makom Ptur. So he assumes, Tzaddik, he assumes that Makom Ptur, according to the Yerushalmi, is a non-Rishus Hayachid or Rishus Harabim, not a Rishus on its own. Our Gemara, the Bavli, says Daled Rishuyos l'Shabbos, that there are 4 different, exclusive types of domains on Shabbos. Whereas the Yerushalmi assumes that anything that's not either Rishus Hayachid or Rishus Harabim or Carmelis is just a non-domain. It's a nothing, and therefore the Yerushalmi is not included on the list, and potentially it would even be mutter legamre, completely permissible to carry and put something onto a makom ptur because you're not putting it onto an isolated and exclusive domain. All right.
Isn't that why it's called a patur? Because you haven't violated anything.
Well, on a deoraisa level, you're right. That's with regard to Shabbos, the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Gimel says that whenever we come along the word patur in Mesechta Shabbos or in Shas, patur means patur aval aser. It's still a rabbinic prohibition, but according to Yerushalmi, it might be completely permitted, even on a derabanan level, because it's not a domain. It's not an exclusive domain in and of itself. So now I want to get to, which is the definition of a rishus hayachid, and the way that I want to frame the conversation is really based on a very, very interesting question that's brought up by Tosos. Tosos over here asks, and because of time, we're not going to read the Tosos inside, but basically Tosos asks. He says, V'tema, the Rabbanon, Kol Eretz Yisrael, Ta'aser Rishus Hayachid. He says that the land of Israel, and then he goes on to say that even Ubavel Nami, and even outside the land of Israel, really all of the lands in the world should be considered Rishus Hayachid. Why? Because the Gemara says that there are certain types of barriers that would create something into being a Rishus Hayachid. What are they? So we said there would have to be a wall that's at least 10 tefachim high. That certainly, if you have 4 of them, you got yourself a Rishus Hayachid. You got yourself a private domain for sure. You can carry within it as much as you want, not a problem. As long as there's an Eruv, there's that communal meal that's connecting you. Another example of something that's a real wall would be not just an erected wall, but even a tel hamitlaket, which is mountainsides that, if they go down a certain at a certain angle, it creates a wall because you view it as if it shoots up to the sky. So a cliff would be a good example of that. La Jolla, a lot of our Eruv is based on tel hamitlaket because it's very hilly and there's a lot of mountains, and therefore you could use those as your mechitzas. The Gemara gives another one, which is a canal, that surrounds a part of the city. We can use that as part of the wall. So the question that Tosos asks is, so then therefore every single land in the world should be considered a private domain. Basically, there's never a Rishus Harabim ever. Why? Because of the continental shelf. Every single continent in the world is considered to be a Rishus Hayachid based on the continental shelf. As soon as there's a drop, as soon as there's a cliff, so then therefore that will make it into a wall that then shoots up to the sky, and therefore it surrounds the entire continent. And there you go. You got yourself a Rishus Hayachid de'oraisa. And therefore, all you need now is you just, and that's the walls. It's not even Rishus HaYachid, only the Araisa, even the Rabbanon. That's it. We should be able to carry everywhere.
Well, what's it called? If it's a cliff, isn't it only a wall on one side?
Yeah, the continent.
Yeah, but you have a wall by the Atlantic. You have a wall by the Pacific. You have a wall at the end of South America. I'm saying that's what the continental shelf is.
Wait, which side of the wall?
The wall.
What do you mean?
Which side of the wall?
Out of the land.
If there's a cliff, how is there a wall for the people who are on top of the cliff?
It's a continental shelf in the water, Ilan.
It's in the water.
But I thought if your Eruv contains a certain number of people, it's not valid.
If the Eruv contains a certain amount of people,
like if it contains 600,000 people, it's not valid or something.
Well, that's because it's part of the definition of being a Rishus Harabim, assuming there aren't walls. But if there are real walls, that if I was able to somehow fit into my house, 1 million people, we're inside of a house. There's a roof, there's walls. That it fits the dimensions of a Rishus HaYachid, then it remains a Rishus HaYachid. As simple as that.
Social distancing, I don't think you want to try 1 million people, Rabbi, but okay.
Might not be such a good idea. Hold on one second. I need to just plug in the computer. So that's the question is every single land in the world should be considered a Rishus HaYachid. So what's the answer? So one answer is given by Tosfos over here is that basically what Tosfos says, and it's very difficult to understand Tosfos over here, but the Tosfos Harash and the Chazon Ish made it easier to understand, which basically is that what I said before, which is that you could have, if you have real walls that contain your Rishus HaYachid, so then it doesn't matter how big it is, doesn't matter how many people are inside of it. That is 100% correct. However, that only applies to man-made walls. If it's natural walls, so then that's part of what God intended when he gave the prohibition of you cannot carry on Shabbos. Part of the prohibition of you cannot carry in a Rishus Harabim means that there is a Rishus Harabim, which means that part of Maisa Bereshis is that God created Rishuyos Harabim. He created public domains. So therefore, by definition, the continental shelf cannot be included in that. However, the Ritva quotes from the Ramban a different answer. The Ramban says that you can only call something a Rishus HaYachid if it's reasonable to call it a private domain. Basically, you need to feel as though you're contained within something. If there is no sense of containment, so then, or being surrounded by something, then it cannot be considered a Rishus HaYachid. The Mishnah Berurah says that he saw the Ramban inside, not just in the Ritva, and that the Ramban said this explicitly, that if you have such a large Eruv that you do not feel as though you feel as though you are being contained at all, so then that is not going to be considered an Eruv. Rav Moshe Feinstein discusses, so what are the parameters of something like this? So he, based on his calculations, what he has figured out is that it's 32 mil. If the Eruv contains a space that's larger than 32 mil, then it cannot be considered a kosher Eruv. So 32 mil is roughly about 96,000 feet.
The amount of square feet.
96,000 square feet, yeah. 96, that right? Because a mil is 2,000 amos. An amma is somewhere between 18 inches to 24 inches. So 3,000 feet per mil. 32 times 3 is 96. So 96,000, right? Yeah. Thank you, engineer. The
That's not that big, Rabbi.
It's not that big. It's not that big, or as much as 32 times 4 is 128,000 square feet. Yeah, which is not that big. Which is why Rav Moshe had a big problem with.
What do you mean hollow?
Or like have an empty circle that's like not Eruv inside the Eruv. Like let's say you have a camp around a lake and like you don't make that criteria.
Oh, that's a very solid question. That's where that is an issue that's discussed also in the Gemara about if you have one rishus inside of another rishus, that could be mevatel the entire eruv. So you basically have to create mechitzas that go around that. So you have there's a town in Massachusetts called Sharon, Massachusetts. Sharon, Massachusetts has a nice, Orthodox community. It's small. It's a nice, small Orthodox community. But apparently they have one of the most unique Eruvin in the world because right in the middle of the town, basically the town sits around in a circle around a lake, right? So they had to construct their Eruv around the city, and then they had to remove the rishus of the lake. They had to remove it when they were constructing their Eruv. So it's constructed in a very unique way. You're 100% right. That could potentially ruin your Eruv. So you have to figure out how to build around it.
Eruvs around the lake.
What?
They have one.
Yeah, but what if you don't want to move from what if you want to carry stuff from one side of the town to the other?
Yeah.
Ilan wants to just split the town into multiple Eruvs. Our Eruv bit, Jacob's.
No, so there are towns that do that. There are towns that do that. I'm saying not even that far a distance. There are towns that have, because of considerations like that, multiple Eruvin. I'll give you an example is Washington Heights. Why is it that they do that? Why don't they just have one big one? Oh, they don't because the Washington Heights basically sits at two different levels, okay? And it's very difficult to construct an Eruv while going up a hill. Here we were able to figure it out. It wasn't such an issue here. But over there, because it's a much smaller area with a very steep hill, so it was very difficult to create the Eruv that way. So they basically have two different Eruvs. So okay, fine. That's a very important Ramban to understand, and halacha l'maisa. This is how some of the considerations that go into constructing Eruvin. Obviously, this is a much larger discussion. As we pointed out before from the Aruch LaNer, Eruvin is one of the most difficult laws to understand, but it is one of the most enjoyable Mesechtas when you delve into it and you figure out all the pieces to it. If I could suggest some recommended reading, is an article that was written up by my Rabbi, Rav Hershel Schachter, Shlita, where it's in English, where he discusses very briefly an overview of Eruvin. He's considered to be the greatest expert in Eruvin probably in the world. He was once one of the Rabbeim at YU brought Rav Schachter to look over the Eruv in their city. So along with Rav Schachter, he brought also their Eruv repairman to the big burly guy Joe if in case Rav Schachter wanted them to make improvements, he was there to make improvements on the spot. So the rabbi introduced Rav Schachter to Joe. And the way he introduced Rav Schachter is he said, Joe, this is Rabbi Schachter. He is the greatest expert in the world on the laws of an Eruv. So Joe looked at me and said, right after me. But the guy we use here, he can climb up and just fix an Eruv, no problem. But the laws of Eruvin are geschmack. I actually went on a Eruv. I learned Eruvin with Rav Schachter and went on an Eruv Torah with Rav Schachter, and it was amazing. I want to though discuss the Gemara we started with. The Gemara we started with was the Gemara that we pointed out about the necessity of having an Eruv. But I want to focus on the first part of that Gemara. The Gemara said the following. Hahu Yanuka, that there was a baby that had to have a bris milah. The ishtapech chamime, and the hot water spilled out. So right away, the rabbis jump on the situation and they say, okay, we have to figure out a way to get the water. What if they weren't able to get the water? Basically, they said that we have to rely on a non-Jew. Let's say there was no non-Jew. So would we have allowed them to heat up the water to do the bris milah or not? Or would we say, no, the bris milah is going to have to wait till Sunday and you can't do the bris milah?
Was Rabbi Eliezer there?
Oh, very good. So according to Rabbi Lazar, which we learned about 2 weeks ago, Rabbi Lazar would say, Machshirei milah are dochin Shabbos. You're able to push off Shabbos, which is exactly what the Baal Ma'or says. The Baal Ma'or says that according to Rabbi Lazar, this wouldn't be an issue. However, says Reb Zachar Levi, the Baal Ma'or, he says that no, we paskin like Rabbi Kiva, we paskin like the Rabbanan, that Machshirei milah are not dochin Shabbos. The preparatory stages of doing the bris milah do not push aside Shabbos, and therefore you would not be able to heat up the water. However, the Ramban disagrees. The Ramban argues on the Baal Ma'or, and he says, no. You don't heat up the hot water now. Rather, do the bris milah, and then you're going to have to heat up the water in order so that you could heal the baby. Why? Because that's pekuach nefesh. So do the bris milah, because there's a mitzvah to do the bris milah. B'yom hashmini yomo b'sar laso. B'yom afilu b'Shabbos. You do the bris milah on the 8th day, even if it's on Shabbos. And then later, oh my gosh, we don't have hot water. We have to heat up. Could you imagine a scenario where they did the bris milah, they didn't even realize they needed hot water, and then the bris milah was done. Now they realize, oh my gosh, the baby could, God forbid, die if we don't wash it with hot water, the infection. Therefore, we have to heat up the hot water right now. Why? It's pekuach nefesh. So says the Ramban, who cares whether or not right now you know you don't have hot water? Do the bris milah, and he quotes a concept with regard to karbanos. Ein mitzvah elam bekomo b'shaita. Right now, you have a mitzvah to do. You do this mitzvah. You don't worry about the future. Later on, there's going to be an issue. You're going to have to violate Shabbos due to pekuach nefesh. Okay, fine. You're going to have to do that. But that's not going to affect your decision-making right now. Says the Baal Ma'or, no. Machshirei milah apply both before Shabbos and after Shabbos. The Gemara over here did not tell us any details about when this water spilled. Did it spill before you did the bris, after you did the bris? It's just telling you that if you don't have the water, you can't do the bris. Unless you have a guy. It didn't give us any other solution. And therefore, you would not be allowed to do the bris milah, because even things that have to do with after the bris are also considered machshirei milah.
Rabbi.
Yes, Adi.
Are you allowed to do preemptive pikuach nefesh?
What does that mean?
Like stabbing someone with an epi. You can't do that on Shabbos, but if they're about to walk through like a bee-infested area or something like that.
I think you're asking a good question. I'm just not understanding it.
Like, since you know that the baby's going to have the bris milah, are you allowed to heat up the water before? Because it's not preparatory. Because it's
okay, so I thought you were asking a different question. The answer to your question is no, because there's no pekuach nefesh right now. I thought you were asking a question that we're going to get to now, which is, are you allowed to put yourself into a situation that is then going to obligate you to violate Shabbos?
Yeah, I was going to ask you. It's not quite secretia, but it sounds almost the same,
right?
Like
you're putting yourself into a situation where you are going to have to violate Shabbos. What's the halacha? Are you allowed to do that, or are you not allowed to do that? So if I were to ask you, according to the Ramban, if you are going to do a mitzvah, he would say yes. Ein mitzvah elam b'komu b'shaita. Right now, do the mitzvah. Later on, you're going to have to do pekuach nefesh. Okay, fine. Just pekuach nefesh. You'll violate Shabbos. That's later. Right now, it's not an issue. Basically, if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, you can put yourself into the state of pekuach nefesh. However, into the state where you're going to have to violate Shabbos for pekuach nefesh. However, according to the Baal Ma'or, certainly you cannot put yourself into a situation even if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, that's going to turn into a pekuach nefesh, that is going to then obligate you to break Shabbos. Okay? The problem with the Baal Ma'or is the following. This is the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Yud Tes Amud Aleph. This is we're bridging Eruvin and Shabbos last week to this week. The Gemara says the following in Mesechta Shabbos on Daf Yud Tes. Tanu Rabbanan, ein mafligim b'sfina, pachos megimel yamim kodem l'Shabbos. That one is not allowed to go on a boat trip 3 days prior to Shabbos. Basically, starting from Thursday, one would not be allowed to get onto a boat before knowing that you're going to be traveling on Shabbos on the boat. Why? So this is a whole discussion in the Rishonim. Why is that? We'll get to it in a minute, though. B'med dvar mamurim, what's the scenario we're talking about? Lidvar harashus, for basic, you're going just on a trip. Okay, you're going fishing. You're just going out on the boat. Okay, you're going for a business trip, something like that. Aval lidvar mitzvah. However, if you're going for the sake of a mitzvah, you have to go onto the boat for kibbud avayim purposes, or you need to go onto the boat in order so that you can, acquire for yourself a lulav and esrog or something. Okay, if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, then shaper dami. Then it's not an issue, even if it's within 3 days before Shabbos. Obviously, getting on Shabbos is an issue, but if it's before Shabbos, it's not going to be an issue if you're going for the sake of a mitzvah. Now, let's ask the question: why is it a problem to get on the boat in the first place? So, Tosfos in Eruvin on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Aleph quotes from the Rashbam. Tosfos in Eruvin says from the Rashbam that the issue with going out on the boat is not a problem according to Beis Hillel. It's a Beis Shammai issue. The Mishnah has a discussion on Daf Yud Zayin. It has a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel with regards to, there is an obligation from the Torah that not only are we not allowed to do work on Shabbos, but even our children are not allowed to do work. Basically, you're not allowed to ask your child, even if they're less than the age of bar mitzvah, to violate Shabbos on your behalf. And there's also a concept called shvisas behemto, which is you're not allowed to have your animal do work for you on Shabbos. Says Beis Shammai, there's also a concept called shvisas keilim, that your utensils are not allowed to do work for you on Shabbos. So, for example, according to Beis Shammai, you would not be allowed to have, let's say you're not allowed to start something before Shabbos that goes into Shabbos, that something is working for you. So, for example, electric lights, according to Beis Shammai, would be problematic. Because you started the malacha before Shabbos, and now it's going into Shabbos. Granted, you are not doing anything, you're passive, but according to Beis Shammai, your objects are still doing work for you on Shabbos. That's a prohibition.
But then how do they get warm food?
What?
Is it because like how do they get warm food?
How'd they get warm food? So they must have heated it up before Shabbos, and that was it.
So they didn't
remained hot.
But I thought that almost sounds like a Sadukim, no?
So yeah, it's a good question. Regardless, though, we constantly like Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel says that your objects are allowed to work for you on Shabbos, fine. So says the Rashbam, this sounds like a Beis Shammai issue. Going out on the boat, it's an issue because the boat is doing work for you on Shabbos. Okay, fine, all right. The other Rishonim are the Rishonim that get more of the spotlight over here. According to the Rif, the issue over here, which is quoted in Shulchan Aruch, is that people get seasick. And when people get seasick, it's going to ruin their Shabbos. We're not concerned that their life is going to be at risk. We're concerned that they're just going to get nauseous. And that's not a way to enjoy yourself on Shabbos. And therefore, the problem is that you might end up having to stay on the boat on Shabbos. And if you're going to end up having to be there on Shabbos, so then you're not going to be able to observe Shabbos the right way through Oneg Shabbos. That's what the Rif says, and that's quoted in Shulchan Aruch. The Baal Ma'or, however, gives the following reason. The Baal Ma'or says that the reason why one is not allowed to go out on the boat 3 days before Shabbos is that it might turn into a scenario of pikuach nefesh. Basically, you're out on the boat, and the boat starts to capsize, or you might end up in some sort of a scenario where we know that traveling by sea is certainly more dangerous than other forms of travel. And therefore, you may end up having to violate Shabbos due to a pekuach nefesh. One is not allowed to put themselves in a scenario where they might end up violating Shabbos due to a pekuach nefesh. However, the Gemara then said, "Aval dvar mitzvah shaper dami." However, if you're going for the sake of a mitzvah, we allow you to take that risk of that you might end up having to violate Shabbos due to pekuach nefesh. So, what did the Ramban just tell me? I'm sorry, what did the Baal Ma'or just tell me? The Baal Ma'or just told me that one is not allowed to put themselves into a situation of pekuach nefesh on Shabbos unless it's for the sake of a mitzvah. What did the Baal Ma'or tell me about the water that spilled for the baby's bris? Are you allowed to do the bris milah knowing you're going to have to violate Shabbos by heating up the water?
Nope.
No. Isn't that a contradiction in the Baal Ma'or? That's a stira. The Baal Ma'or, on the one hand, commenting on the Gemara over here on Daf Yutes and Shabbos, says that you are allowed to go out onto the boat, even though you might end up having to violate Shabbos due to pekuach nefesh, if it's for the sake of a mitzvah. However, when it came to the baby's case, you're not allowed to do the bris milah, even though it's putting yourself into a scenario where you're going to have to violate Shabbos for the sake of a mitzvah.
But
that's a major contradiction.
But the boat is before Shabbos, no? Is that the difference?
Very good. So that's the first answer that the Stipler gives. The Kehilas Yaakov in Siman Tesvav on Mesechta Shabbos says, number one answer, like Gavin says, there's a difference before Shabbos and on Shabbos.
What?
The bris milah is on Shabbos, and therefore that would be a d'oraisa. However, before Shabbos, that's just a d'rabbanan that the rabbis instituted. You're not allowed to put yourself into that scenario. But for the sake of a mitzvah, the rabbanan never goes there. Very good. Then the Stipler gives a second answer. The Stipler's second answer is?
I only read the first part.
What?
I said I only read the first part of the Stipler.
Oh, the good thing is that Elon Daniel read the second part. Where's Elon Daniel?
You can get him to stop eating?
You would tell me, what would be another answer to answer up the Stipler? To answer up the stira and the Baal Ma'or? No, think. What's the difference
They
between
lost in anger that they couldn't control themselves.
But I guess it's also psicration, no?
Oh, what do you mean by that? Don't use psicration. Use another word.
It's a suffix that you'll end up in a doubt.
Which case is a suffix?
The boat.
The boat case. You may or may not end up in a case of pekuach nefesh. In that scenario, so then you would be allowed to go for the sake of a mitzvah. You could take the risk if it's for a mitzvah. However, the case with the baby, when you do the bris milah, what are you going to have to do?
You're going to have to heat the water.
You're going to have to violate Shabbos to heat up the water. So you can't be machnas yourself if it's a vadai that you're going to have to violate Shabbos for pekuach nefesh. So that's the second answer of the Stipler.
How many do you have? I'm out of answers.
Those are the two answers of the Stipler. Rav Shechter, though, gave another answer. And this is the answer I think you were hinting to earlier. The difference between the two cases is really that there's not necessarily a difference in the cases. Let's assume they're both a case of vadai. Let's assume that that they are equal. All else is equal in the cases. Why is it that in one scenario the Baal Ma'or is saying that you're allowed to be machnas yourself, you're allowed to put yourself into a situation that you're going to have to violate Shabbos due to pekuach nefesh, whereas the case of the baby, you're not allowed to? What's the baby case? Heating up the water. Heating up the water is machshirei milah. We paskin machshirei milah are not doche Shabbos. It's as simple as that. It's not a special din, a special halacha about being machnis yourself into a pekuach nefesh. Of course, the Ravid agrees with the Ramban that one is allowed to be machnis themselves into a pekuach nefesh for the sake of a mitzvah. That's what our Gemara on Daf Yutes in Shabbos is saying right now. However, not for machshirei mila, because that's a special gzeres hakasov. When it comes to machshirei mila, we paskin machshirei mila, the preparatory stages of mila are not doche Shabbos, and therefore it's not going to override Shabbos. Okay, I wanted to see one last Gemara, but we're not going to see it inside. I'm just going to tell you outside. The Aggadah, as part of our survey of Mesechta Eruvin, the Gemara tells a story about Rabbi Yochanan. The Rabbi Yochanan went to go.
Rabbi, why isn't Sefer Eruvin in Shabbos?
Mesechta Eruvin is not in Shabbos because Eruvin is its own topic. It's a very good question because it's obviously related to the laws of Shabbos, and it's related to the 39 of the 39th of the 39 malachos, that of motzi merishus l'rishus, of carrying on Shabbos. You're 100% right. But what Eruvin discusses is really the structural piece of how to build Eruvin, the laws of setting up an Eruv that really doesn't have to do with the laws of Shabbos as much as it has to do with the laws of constructing an Eruv. So that's why it comes right after Shabbos for that purpose, but that's why it's not necessarily part of Mesechta Shabbos itself. Very, very good question, though, Tzaddik. The Gemara discusses, there are beautiful Gemaras about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah in Mesechta Eruvin, Daf Nun Gimel, Nun Daled, Nun Hey, have beautiful Gemaras about Talmud Torah. And the Gemara tells a story that Rabbi Yochanan went to go visit the Chabura of Rabbi Oshia. Rabbi Oshia had 12 students, and Rabbi Yochanan went to go study with the 12 students of Rabbi Oshia for 18 days. And during those 18 days, Rabbi Yochanan said that he was blown away by the fact that he was able to understand the lave of each and every one of them. He was able to understand the chachma of each and every one of them. He was able to understand each and every one of the students of Rabbi Oshia. So the Avodas Halevi, Rav Ruderman, the Rosh Hashiva of Ner Yisrael, asked the question: why was it so important for Rabbi Yochanan to understand the students of Rabbi Oshia? Well, you want to go learn Torah from them? Okay, fine. So you learn Torah from them. Why is he coming away with a note saying, I was able to understand the emotions of each one. I was able to understand the intellectual capacities of each one. Why was that important to Rabbi Yochanan? So Ruderman explains, because the Gemara in Tainus tells us on Daf Zayin, a very famous Gemara, Rav Huna taught that Lamadati harbe merabosai, I learned a lot from my teachers. V'yoser mi chaverai, I learned even more from my friends, but I learned the most from my students. What do you see from that Gemara? That there's a tremendous amount to learn from your friends, amount to learn from your chaverim. In order for one to be able to become a Talmud Chacham, you need to understand your chaverim. You have to have dibuk chaverim. It's one of the ways to acquire Torah. Without dibuk chaverim, without the connectivity that we have between one another, so then you're not going to be able to become a tremendous Talmud Chacham. You're not going to be able to become someone that truly acquires Torah. And that's why, says Rav Ruderman, that's why, it's no coincidence that, the grave mistake that we mourn the students of Rabbi Kiva having perished due to the fact that they did not respect one another, meaning that they didn't see the value in learning from one another. They didn't see the value of a chavrusa, of learning from each other. That's why we mourn that right as we're leading up to Shavuos. We just finished mourning that now, but we learn that we mourn that as we lead up to Shavuos. Why? Because that is one of the ways that we're going to be able to have a Kabbalah Satorah, is if we respect, understand, acknowledge, and appreciate the Torah that comes from one another. Okay, we'll stop here. Hadran Alach Mesechta Eruvin. Next week, in Mirza Hashem, we will move on to Mesechta Psachim, God willing. All right.
Bye-bye.